The Harlan family, the father behind the Fairmont quadruplets madness. In the spring of 1845, in the small Midwestern town of Harlan, amidst the storm of westward expansion and frontier conflicts, the local press trumpeted a miracle. 4 identical boys, born healthy, surviving, and all at once. They were photographed, paraded in matching clothes, and celebrated as a beacon of hope in a turbulent era. But behind the orchestrated smiles lay a darkness. They were given a moniker, the Fairmont quadruplets, a name derived from the Latin for fated birth. What the public never knew was the father's brutality, the tortures carried out in silence, the barbaric medical interventions, and the genetic specter that haunted their bloodline. By their teenage years, all 4 had descended into hysteria and melancholia. The researchers of the 19th century seized their chance. From 1860 to 1863, they were institutionalized in a Kirkbride plan asylum, subjected to craniometry, purges, and reduced to charts. Genetically identical, yet their fates fractured into unequal pieces. One permanently institutionalized, one semi-functional, one hovering between dependence and freedom, and the last who managed to marry. Their story became one of early psychiatry's most famous case studies, igniting the debate over heredity and environment, over genes and trauma. Dr. Elias Thornton would call it a sorrowful complicity between bloodline and violence. To science, they were a foundation. To themselves, they were prisoners in an unchosen jail. And today, their names live not in family albums, but in medical journals. 4 miracles, born, consumed by illness, and remembered as a warning. If you want to hear more forgotten tragedies of history, unearthed and told unvarnished, subscribe to The Forgotten Echo and let me know in the comments. Where are you listening from tonight? The town of Harlan stirred to life in 1845. Local newspapers carried the news with exultant headlines. 4 brothers, born at the same time, all surviving and healthy. The photographs quickly followed. Faded, black and white images of newborns, swaddled in cloth, laid in a row, their faces nearly indistinguishable. Amidst westward expansion, famine, and conflict with native peoples, they were a glimmer of hope. Identical quadruplet births were so rare that the probability was said to be 1 in 10 million. With rudimentary medicine, their survival was near impossible. The family's real name was withheld from the public, a protective measure put in place almost immediately. The medical community, which would later lay claim to them, gave them a moniker. They called them the Fairmont quadruplets. It was a term borrowed from Latin, meaning fated birth. It sounded academic, detached, even protective. But buried within it was a dark premonition. The very society that celebrated their arrival seemed to anticipate something ominous. In their earliest days, the 4 brothers were displayed like rarities. Visitors flocked to the hospital for a glimpse into the row of bassinets. Photographers captured their mother, holding all 4 in an awkward pose, her arms strained under the weight. The boys were named Elias, Theo, Marcus, and Victor, though they would later be remembered primarily by the initials ETMV. From the beginning, they belonged more to an assembling archive than to themselves. What the public saw in 1845 was a story of survival. These 4 infants, identical in appearance, had been born into a crude medical era, unready for such anomalies. Doctors scrambled to measure, weigh, and document them as if their arrival in the world demanded immediate scientific preservation. Hospitals of the time had little experience keeping multiple birth infants alive, and yet here they were, breathing, crying, their lives recorded in journals, their images distributed to newspapers alongside news of battles and wagon trains. They became a distraction from hardship, a symbol of possibility. But the name Fairmont cannot be ignored. It was a fabrication designed to obscure their true identities, to shield them from public curiosity. Yet the word carried a darker interpretation, fated, not miraculous, not blessed. In its Latin roots lay a premonition, a reminder that nature sometimes births not triumphs, but warnings. Even in those early days, the tension between the public miracle and the private truth was palpable. Neighbors described the family as reserved, reluctant to embrace the attention. Doctors, too, remarked on the father's rigid demeanor, his insistence that his family not be trespassed upon by the curious. Reporters were turned away from the modest home. Yet the photographs of 4 boys lying shoulder to shoulder traveled further than the family could have imagined. Their anonymity lasted only as long as the headlines needed it. The 4 brothers grew up under a strange double identity. In the public imagination, they were symbols of health and resilience, living proof of the quiet miracles of a nation in formation. In reality, they lived in a household already burdened by suspicion and unease. The father's stern nature was apparent to those who knew the family, though never reported in the glowing press accounts. In the local hospital ledger, one doctor had scrawled the word irregular next to the entry for their birth, a neutral phrase that could allude to the rarity, but could just as easily apply to the unsettled atmosphere surrounding them. The scientific community took interest immediately. 4 identical brothers were a natural experiment in genetics, a chance to observe nature's carbon copy. At a time when early psychiatry was obsessed with heredity, with bad blood, tainted stock, and family curses, these infants seemed destined for scrutiny. The irony is difficult to ignore. From the first day of their lives, they were marked as subjects for study. They would be measured not just against one another, but against the darker questions of what traits the bloodline carries. As the brothers grew, their public identity remained a bright and tidy picture. Photographs show them in identical clothing, lined up like porcelain dolls. Perfect symmetry, rehearsed smiles, an image designed to reassure. Yet their moniker hung in the air like a prophecy, fated birth. It was a phrase that seemed to insist there would be no happy ending, only a cautionary tale. In 1845, the world looked at these 4 brothers and saw promise. But promise has a way of souring under pressure, especially when it is born into a house that carries an unspoken history. For the Fairmont brothers, the miracle of their arrival was the beginning of something else entirely, a story that science and society would claim, dissect, and archive until the miracle was remembered not for its light, but for the shadow it contained. The photographs remain, still circulating in archives, a row of infants wrapped in white cloth. The miracle is plain, but so is the tension beneath it. These were not simply 4 children, they were symbols of fate, labeled before they could speak. Their lives were documented as if they belonged not to a family, but to history. The word chosen for them captured it best: fated birth, a celebration that carried its own warning. To the outside world, the Fairmont family projected the gloss of a pioneer success story. The 4 brothers were paraded in identical clothes, their hair neatly combed, lined up for photographers who delighted in the symmetry. Their father presented himself as a pillar of discipline and respectability, and their mother, silent and submissive, completed the picture of a devout, orderly household. Neighbors and acquaintances saw the staged portraits and assumed the story was as simple as it appeared. 4 sons, healthy, identical, thriving, but behind the front door, the home was ruled not by harmony, but by domination. The father's word was absolute, his authority rigid and unquestionable. Later accounts reveal a family enveloped in control, schedules dictated, freedom curtailed, individuality crushed. In his view, the miracle of their identical birth was not a gift, but a challenge to his authority, and he met it with measures that blurred the line between paternal guidance and pathological possession. The boys were raised in a regime where normal childhood freedoms were treated as threats to morality. Their father was obsessed with purity, with appearances, with stamping out what he called indolence or rebellion. He called one son the lazy one, another the defiant one, names that reduced them to caricatures instead of children. Punishments were not mere discipline, but acts of humiliation that reinforced his role as judge and executioner in the home. The cruelty went beyond words. Medical records and psychiatric accounts confirm that 2 of the brothers were subjected to brutal medical interventions. Procedures of bloodletting and craniometry were performed under the guise of quelling an inner fury. In the father's mind, this was a corrective measure, an act of control disguised as morality. In reality, it was a torture that left physical and psychological scars. Such procedures, though barbaric, were consistent with the medicine of the time, considered treatments for hysteria or volatile tempers. But in this context, they underscored the father's relentless determination to govern not only his sons' behavior, but their very bodies. The mother played her part in silence, submissive, cautious, She offered little resistance. Some accounts suggest she was herself overwhelmed, perhaps fearful of provoking the same wrath that was aimed at the children. Her compliance, whether born of fear or resignation, created the impression of complicity. The father's rules became law, and the mother's passivity ensured they were carried out without protest. The result was a household that more closely resembled an experiment in domination than a family. Yet none of this appeared in the carefully curated public image. Photographs of the brothers at play, arranged in neat rows or posing with toys, circulated as evidence of domestic bliss. The symmetry of their appearance reassured an audience that never glimpsed the cost. For every arranged smile, there was a hidden cycle of punishment, a private world of secrets where the father's power determined every outcome. Later, investigators and psychiatrists who studied the brothers pieced these details together from fragments, notes in medical files, testimony recorded in institutions, memories that slipped through the cracks of guarded accounts. The pattern that emerged was unmistakable. The very home that was celebrated as the cradle of a miracle was, in fact, a crucible of control. A place where individuality was not nurtured but flattened. The horror lay not in public spectacle, but in its quiet regularity. There were no headlines about the punishments, no photographs documenting the fear. Instead, the violence existed in the silence preserved in the way the brothers complied, the way they posed without protest, the way their lives were bent into lines as rigid as the photographs themselves. In retrospect, the contrast between image and reality is staggering. In the public eye, the Fairmont home represented health, resilience, and the wonders of nature. To those who would later uncover their truth, the family portrait became a mask, concealing a household where children were stripped of their autonomy and reshaped by a tyrannical hand. The Fairmont home was not merely strict. It was an environment where punishment had morphed into pathology, where control metastasized into cruelty, and where scientific curiosity would later find fertile ground to explain heredity through tragedy. The smiling photographs remain, but beneath them lies a story of secrets and trauma, a story of innocence reshaped by domination. It is difficult now to look at those early images without feeling the weight of what they hide. The home that housed the four brothers was less a nursery than a laboratory, a controlled space where individuality was dismantled, where silence was enforced, and where trauma wore the disguise of discipline. It was in this environment, unseen by the neighbors who celebrated the family's miracle, that the true foundation for their collapse was laid. Long before the four brothers were born, shadows fell across the family tree. In the records later pieced together by psychiatrists, the signs were unmistakable. Their paternal grandmother had lived much of her life in what neighbors described as a state of paranoia. She suspected she was being followed, that her food was poisoned. In another era, this might have been dismissed as eccentricity. In the language of early psychiatry, it was an early warning, a sign of a genetic line that would not die with her. Other relatives showed similar fractures. An uncle was said to have suffered multiple breakdowns. There were cousins who had vanished into asylums, their names scrawled in ledgers next to words like mania and melancholia. Such records, stark and unforgiving, became the scaffolding upon which psychiatrists of the era would build their theories of heredity. To them, the four brothers were not merely four identical siblings, they were the latest iteration of a tainted bloodline. The scientific mood of the era was unforgiving. Psychiatry was obsessed with heredity, shaped by the influence of early eugenics. Texts spoke of tainted stock, of bad blood that ran through families like a contagion. To be born into a lineage that was already marked was, in the eyes of doctors, to carry an inescapable destiny. The four brothers were presented as proof, not as anomalies to be celebrated, but as specimens to be monitored as they grew. Living evidence of a genetic curse manifesting in quadruplicate. The language of these records is chilling to read now. Terms like degenerate and defective appear without hesitation, as if the very existence of these children was a diagnosis. The clinical gaze spared no one in their lineage, and the grandmother's paranoia became not just her condition, but an indictment of all her descendants. The uncle's instability was not his private misfortune, but a clue, a symptom of a broader corruption in the blood. By the time the four brothers were old enough to be studied, the verdict was already set. Their illness was waiting for them at birth. In the small town where they lived, The whispers followed a similar logic. Neighbors did not speak in the formal vocabulary of psychiatry, but the suspicion was the same. They called it bad blood. Families in rural America were often defined by reputation. For the Fairmonts, the reputation had hardened into something more sinister, the idea that madness ran in their veins. It was spoken of quietly, but it shaped how people watched the boys. Their identical faces, once celebrated, now held an eerie sameness that only reinforced the fear. If one were to break, surely the others would follow. The collision of science and rumor created a trap from which the brothers could never fully escape. The doctors brought their instruments, the neighbors brought their suspicion, and together they painted a portrait of inevitability. In a culture steeped in genetic determinism, there was little room to imagine that nurture, environment, or abuse could shape the course of a mind. Blood was fate. Lineage was prophecy. With modern eyes, it is possible to trace how environmental trauma could have interacted with a genetic vulnerability, the father's tyrannical cruelty, the invasive procedures imposed in the name of morality, the constant humiliation. All of this could have triggered the expression of illness in minds that were already fragile. But for the psychiatry of the day, such nuance was unnecessary. The brothers' struggles confirmed what the textbooks already claimed. Heredity was destiny, and this family was cursed from the start. The image of the grandmother, isolated in her suspicions, remains as a prelude. The uncles' breakdowns, the cousins committed to asylums all appear in the record as omens. When the four brothers began to fracture in their teenage years, the psychiatrists saw not individuals breaking under unique pressures, but the inevitable continuation of a pattern. The diagnosis seemed to stretch backward through the family tree, rewriting history to fit the theory. By the time the brothers sat in the rooms of the Kirkbride Asylum, undergoing craniometry and crude treatments, their story had already been framed as a case study in hereditary madness. Their names in the ledgers stood beside the words that had haunted their family for generations: hysteria, melancholia, paranoia. The question was no longer whether they would fall ill, but how soon and how completely. It was in this sense that their fate seemed to have been decided long before the first symptom appeared. The curse was not just biological but narrative, a legacy of suspicion reinforced by doctors, neighbors, and the very culture that had once celebrated their birth as a miracle. In the harsh light of those records, the miracle had faded into something darker. 4 sons, born identical, not to escape their family's past, but to repeat it in unison. For years, the Fairmont brothers seemed to embody the innocence their birth had promised. Teachers described them as polite, neatly dressed, indistinguishable from one another, except for minor quirks in handwriting or posture. In public, they moved in formation, their symmetry still regarded as a small-town marvel. Photographers continued to visit, arranging the boys in neat rows for another image of harmony. But beneath the surface, the fractures had begun to appear, first as hairline cracks, then spreading wider with each passing year. The earliest signs were subtle. A teacher's report noted that one of the boys had grown withdrawn, refusing to play with classmates during recess, standing rigidly at the edge of the schoolyard, as if unsure he belonged. Another was caught whispering to himself in class, his lips moving silently, his eyes unfocused. At first, these were dismissed as personality quirks, the oddities of identical children growing up under constant comparison. But the incidents multiplied, each brother showing patterns that, when taken together, began to map a darker trajectory. By adolescence, the changes could not be ignored. One brother began reporting that voices followed him at night, taunting him, whispering insults he could not silence. Another accused classmates of plotting against him, believing friends were passing secret messages. Their father's punishments, harsh and unrelenting, only deepened the isolation, pushing them further inside themselves. The home, already a place of surveillance, became a crucible of suspicion. What might have been the normal turmoil of adolescence was instead sharpened into pathology. Medical notes from later years tracked the escalation with clinical detachment. Words like withdrawn, delusional, flat affect appeared repeatedly, stripped of emotion but carrying an unmistakable weight. One psychiatrist recorded that a brother seemed frozen, staring blankly for long periods, unresponsive to questions. Another was described as agitated, suspicious, hyper-vigilant to the point of paranoia. The diagnostic categories of the era, crude as they were, had found in these boys a perfect illustration. The symmetry that once captivated outsiders now became grotesque as the illnesses manifested in parallel. It was as if four mirrors, once perfect, began to crack in sequence. Each fissure reflected the others, each breakdown echoing through the family like a refrain. While one brother cried out about invisible conspirators, another retreated into a silence so profound that days could pass without a word. Yet the rhythm of their decline remained coordinated, each step into chaos mirrored by the next. By the age of 18, the conclusion was inescapable. All four brothers shared the same diagnosis: hysteria and melancholia. For the doctors studying them, this was both extraordinary and horrifying. Four identical quadruplets, sharing the same genetic code, had succumbed to the same disorder. It was a case that seemed to collapse the debate between nature and nurture into a single, tragic outcome. The researchers saw in them not just patients, but proof for the theories that had long hovered at the edge of psychiatry. The contrast between their public image and their private reality was stark. The photographs of their youth still circulated, four smiling boys in matching clothes. But those images now seemed to mock the truth. Behind that facade, their lives had narrowed to institutions, hospital wards, and supervised care. The boys who had once been displayed as wonders of nature were now studied as case studies in hereditary illness. The community that had celebrated their birth now spoke of them differently. The whispers of bad blood had hardened into certainty. Neighbors recalled the grandmother's paranoia, the uncle's breakdowns, and nodded with understanding. What was once a miracle had become a confirmation of the family curse. Their father's tyrannical rule, once hidden, was now seen as a contributing factor. Yet the focus remained on the bloodline, on the destiny written in the body rather than in the trauma. For the brothers themselves, the transformation was not abstract. Their days were filled with the routines of psychiatric care. Purgatives taken under supervision, questions repeated by doctors seeking coherent answers, craniometry instruments fitted for clinical assessment. Their individuality dissolved into case numbers. Their experience was reduced to charts. In the eyes of medicine, they became less four human beings than four expressions of a single condition. The horror of their story lies in its symmetry. Many families endure the illness of one child. Few watch all their children break in sequence. For the Fairmonts, the reflection was absolute. The miracle of their identical birth had morphed into a mirror of pathology, a study in inevitability. By the time they were all officially diagnosed, the line between miracle and tragedy had been crossed. What began as a celebration had narrowed into a case study. Their names appeared in journals, their lives distilled into data, and in that transition lay the cruelest truth. The four brothers, once exhibited as proof of life's wonder, had become something else entirely. The miracle of the birth had become a medical record of madness. By 1860, the Fairmont brothers had become a clinical curiosity. Four identical siblings, each diagnosed with hysteria melancholia before the age of 18, represented what psychiatrists had long theorized but rarely observed. In 1860, their case was officially taken on by a Kirkbride Plan asylum, where they would spend 3 years under observation. What began as a family tragedy was now translated into a research opportunity. The transfer itself had a ritualistic quality, as if they were being moved from private misfortune into the public record. Each brother was assigned his initials: Elias, Theo, Marcus, Victor abbreviated to ETMV, as per the institution that would become both their caretaker and their custodian. The choice was not merely symbolic, it was a reminder that they were no longer seen primarily as individuals, but as representatives of a study. Inside the asylum's halls, the atmosphere was sterile and severe. The clinical white walls, the long corridors with numbered doors, the smell of disinfectant, this became the landscape of their early adulthood. Staff guided them from procedure to procedure with a machine-like efficiency. Craniometry instruments were fitted to their heads in search of structural irregularities. Blood was drawn for analysis, their interpretations of ambiguous ink blots dutifully recorded. A monster, a void. Each word was preserved in handwritten notes, stripped of context, filed away in folders that would outlive the men themselves. The questionnaires became a daily ritual. How many voices today? How loud? Do they command you or merely comment? The answers were charted, compared across the brothers, scored against diagnostic scales that reduced paranoia and delusion to neat columns of numbers. The very thing that had once made them extraordinary, their sameness, was now exploited by science. They were inward-facing mirrors, reflecting variations of the same illness, offering researchers a rare opportunity to study a parallel decline. Yet the brothers did not respond uniformly. One was cooperative, eager to please the doctors, answering questions precisely, sitting still for the procedures. Another grew suspicious, refusing to speak, believing the instruments were designed not to record his thoughts, but to implant them. A third oscillated between cooperation and resistance, at times calm, at others erupting in sudden fits of rage. The fourth sat quietly through most of it, distant, his face a mask of indifference, as if he had retreated beyond reach. The differences in their responses were, themselves, a kind of data, more proof that identical biology could fracture into separate paths under pressure. The coldness of the research environment only deepened the sense of alienation. There were no family photographs on the walls, no reminders of childhood or kinship. Instead, the brothers were reintroduced to one another as subjects in a controlled comparison. Observers noted their interactions with the detachment of anthropologists, documenting who initiated conversation, who withdrew, who mimicked the gestures of the others. What had once been the intimacy of a shared childhood was now reduced to coded behaviors in the margins of a notebook. By 1863, thousands of pages of data had been generated. Graphs charted the severity of delusions. Tables compared the number of hospitalizations. Charts tracked cognitive deficits. The brothers' humanity was flattened into variables: emotional response, disorganized thought, paranoia index. When compiled, the case became one of the most famous in psychiatric literature, not for who the brothers were, but for how completely they could be quantified. The published documents read with an almost chilling detachment. The four young men appear less as humans than as instruments through which the discipline could test its theories. Their tragedy became evidence, their suffering a proof point. The book that followed in 1865 framed them as the perfect case study of heredity and environment conspiring in madness. What haunts most is the image of them in those labs. Four identical men, once celebrated as a miracle, now sitting under gaslight, the craniometry instruments tracing their skulls, the ink blots spread before them, each answer, each reaction recorded not for its human meaning but for its utility. To their doctors, they were not sons or brothers. They were living experiments, a convergence of biology and environment, neatly arranged into medical files. The miracle of their birth had long since faded. In its place was a colder miracle, the kind that science embraces: four identical patients, tracked in their synchronous decline. In the eyes of psychiatry, they were no longer extraordinary for surviving together. They were extraordinary for collapsing in unison. And in that sterile environment, their lives became something permanent but unfeeling. The data was preserved, the humanity was classified, the individuality was lost. As the Fairmont brothers entered the annals of psychiatric history, their case immediately agitated one of the discipline's oldest questions: is mental illness written in the body or carved by experience? In the mid-19th century, psychiatry was still torn between genetic determinists and environmental reformers. For one faction, the brothers were proof that bloodlines carried madness like a contagion. For the other, they were victims of a brutal father and a childhood governed by fear. The debate came to a head in 1865 when Dr. Elias Thornton published The Fairmont Quadruplets, a case study and analysis of heredity and environment. In its pages, he attempted to capture what he called a sorrowful complicity, the idea that illness arose not from heredity or environment alone, but from their corrosive interaction. The vulnerability, Thornton wrote, may have been carried in the genes. The expression of that vulnerability was summoned and amplified by a pathogenic environment. The evidence for heredity seemed undeniable. All four brothers, sharing identical DNA, had developed hysteria and melancholia by early adulthood. The statistical odds of this happening by chance were vanishingly small. For Thornton and his colleagues, such a convergence suggested a genetic fault line that could not be dismissed. Their grandmother's paranoia, their uncle's breakdowns, the cousins committed to asylums, the family record seemed to echo through the generations. To speak of random coincidence felt naive, but the environment in which the brothers were raised was equally damning. The father's cruelty was well documented, the punishments that morphed into torture, the invasive craniometry and bloodletting justified as medicine, the constant surveillance that turned the home into a regime. His obsession with purity, his labeling of his sons as lazy or defiant, left wounds that psychiatry could not simply file under genetics. Even in the clinical notes, the household was described as toxic, a word that acknowledged trauma in the language usually reserved for genetics. Thornton's theory cut across the divide by refusing to offer psychiatry the easy comfort of a single cause. Instead, he forced the discipline to entertain a disturbing possibility: that blood and brutality were intertwined, that a genetic vulnerability had lain dormant until the environment attacked, and that the combination had destroyed the brothers in ways that neither factor alone could have achieved. The implications were profound. If heredity alone had determined the brothers' fate, then psychiatry could view them as tragically inevitable, but foreordained. If environment alone had broken them, then reforming parenting and social conditions could offer hope. But the idea of complicity meant no such relief. It meant that madness could not be stopped by reproductive policies, nor by simple reforms. It meant that families could carry both the seeds of illness and the conditions that made those seeds sprout. In the clinical literature, the Fairmonts became a symbol of this uncomfortable middle ground. The charts and graphs could not capture the tyrannical presence of the father. Yet the testimony of witnesses left no doubt as to its power. The genetic statistics could not explain why one brother retained more function than the others. Yet environment alone could not account for the eerie symmetry of their decline. The case defied the neatness that psychiatry craved. In their small town, neighbors had framed the story in stark terms: bad blood. For them, heredity explained it all. But Thornton's analysis undermined that certainty. He showed how trauma could activate vulnerability, how cruelty could become the trigger that turned a possibility into a pathology. His phrase, "a sorrowful complicity," has endured precisely because it is unsatisfying. It offers no clean answer, only a reminder that human suffering often resists categorization. The brothers themselves bore the consequences of this unresolved debate. They were treated simultaneously as evidence of a genetic corruption and as victims of parental abuse. Doctors used their lives to argue theory, while journalists continued to circulate their photographs. In the tension between nature and nurture, their humanity was once again flattened into a proof point. The legacy of Thornton's work was not the clarity it brought, but the uncertainty it forced psychiatry to confront. The Fairmont case revealed that neither heredity nor environment could stand alone as an explanation. The illness of the four identical brothers was born of their convergence, a fate braided from blood and brutality, sealed by history, but never fully explained. And so, the conclusion was left as unsettling as the lives it sought to describe. Madness here was not destiny or accident, but the product of both. Neither the body nor the home could be exonerated. Together, they had woven a future from which the brothers could not escape. The four brothers had been born as one, identical in every measurable aspect of biology. Their lives began in unison: the same hospital room, the same cradle of public fascination, the same names bound together by a moniker. Yet as adulthood unfolded, that sameness shattered. Hysteria and melancholia did not move through them mechanically. It carved uneven paths, leaving one brother more functional, another confined to hospital wards, and the others trapped in an uneasy middle ground. Hospital records preserve that unevenness with a clinical chill. Victor was described as a chronic patient, unfit for community living. His delusions were persistent, his agitation unyielding. He spent most of his adult life in the revolving corridors of asylums, where the seasons changed outside but the interior remained constant. Medication rounds, group therapy sessions, sterile beds. Marcus was classified as semi-functional, capable of simple manual labor under supervision, but prone to sudden absences, bouts of paranoia that made him unemployable. Elias fluctuated between institutionalizations and fragile periods of independence, his condition unpredictable enough to keep him tethered to state support. Only Theo managed to build something resembling a life, a trade as a blacksmith, a marriage, children. Even he was not untouched by the illness, but his symptoms were mild enough to permit the illusion of normalcy. This divergence mystified the scientific community. Identical DNA should have produced identical outcomes, yet here was proof that genetic determinism could only go so far. Psychiatrists debated whether the difference lay in birth order, in subtle variations of environment within the same home, or in the arbitrary violence of the illness itself. No explanation was satisfying, the randomness of it all unsettled, the very theories the case was meant to clarify. Employment records from later years illustrate this uneven future with bureaucratic starkness. One brother's file lists termination due to absence multiple times in a decade. Another's ends abruptly with permanent disability. The surviving brother's, in contrast, shows steady work as a blacksmith, his name tied to decades of payroll entries. In these fragments, the arc of the divergence becomes clear. Four born identical, their futures broken into entirely different shapes. Daily life reflected that unevenness too. Interviews with caregivers described one brother who spent his afternoons pacing the same narrow hallway, muttering to himself, convinced he was being observed. Another was known to sit silently for hours, meals untouched, his gaze fixed on a point no one else could see. In contrast, the most functional brother was observed chatting with co-workers, sharing a quiet laugh, though colleagues noted a tension, a need for structure, and his frequent absences for anxiety. The differences were visible not just in psychiatric notes, but in the ordinary rhythms of life. Who could hold a job? Who could form relationships? Who could leave the asylum gates at the end of the day? For researchers, the uneven futures became a second experiment. They had expected symmetry, four identical brothers collapsing in identical ways. Instead, they found a variation that defied easy categorization. It was as if hysteria melancholia had dealt its blows unevenly, striking some harder, sparing others just enough to create the illusion of survival. Thornton himself noted this unsettling arbitrariness. Identical genetics did not yield identical fates. The unease of the case lay in that very arbitrariness. Families often cling to patterns, to explanations that arrange suffering into something logical. But here, the differences felt random, as if chance itself had chosen which brother would marry, which would work, which would be indefinitely confined. The identical birth had promised sameness. The illness delivered only disparity. In later years, as journalists revisited the case, they struggled to reconcile the divergence. How could one brother raise children while another could not safely leave a ward? How could the same DNA produce both competence and incapacity? The answer remained elusive. Psychiatry could only point to the interplay of trauma, environment, and genetics, but the specific details remained vague, a puzzle with pieces that never quite fit. The Fairmont brothers serve as a reminder that genetics is not destiny in any simple sense. Four lives that began as mirrors and ended as shards, scattered across the spectrum of illness and survival. Their futures were carved not with precision, but with randomness, as if fate itself had turned the same key in four locks and found each door opened differently. Their identical childhood photographs remain as a cruel counterpoint. Four boys in matching outfits, looking into the camera with the sameness that once reassured. In retrospect, those images hide the truth. Sameness at birth did not deliver sameness in the future. By the early 1900s, decades had passed since the Fairmont brothers first entered the rooms of the Kirkbride Asylum. They were no longer the young men whose faces had filled medical journals, but middle-aged, their lives already shaped by the illness and the institutions that defined them. Yet psychiatry had not forgotten them. The brothers were summoned again, this time to undergo a new wave of testing, part of the discipline's effort to apply modern tools to a case that remained a touchstone of genetic psychiatry. The atmosphere was no less clinical than it had been in the 1,860 seconds, but the instruments had changed. The cruder craniometry was supplemented with cognitive tests, psychologists timing responses with stopwatches, assessing attention with repetitive tasks, and calculating memory through increasingly complex recall exercises. Each brother was evaluated not as a man seeking treatment, but as a subject being revisited. An experiment continued. The results showed small slivers of progress. Treatments like purgatives and sedatives had blunted the edges of delusion and paranoia. Doctors noted that one brother, who in the 1,860 seconds was described as frozen, mute, could now sustain simple conversations. Another, once prone to violent agitation, was calmer, more cooperative with the tests. The psychological charts recorded advances measured in millimeters, a few more digits remembered in sequence, a slightly longer attention span, a fractionally faster reaction to visual cues. In clinical language, these improvements were hailed as significant progress, but the reality was quieter. The men were not restored, they were simply less broken. The recovery was never even. The most functional brother continued to live outside institutions, holding his steady job as a blacksmith, his cognitive scores reflecting that stability. Another remained partially independent, though tests showed wide fluctuations. Attentive one day, deeply distracted the next, his performance unpredictable. The two most impaired brothers showed improvement from their former states, but their results remained far below the threshold of normal functioning. Hospital notes described them as minimally improved, still dependent. Scientists seized on these contrasts. Identical genetics had, once again, produced different outcomes. Medicine and environment had softened the course of the illness, but they had not erased the fractures. In journals, the case was cited as proof of both the potential and the limits of psychiatric treatment. Drugs could manage symptoms, but they could not undo decades of trauma, nor could they rewrite the biology that had made the brothers vulnerable in the first place. The tone of the reports remained as detached as ever. Tables of numbers replaced the brothers' names. Graphs compared their scores on verbal recall, visual tracking, and problem-solving. In one study, the average memory span had lengthened by less than a single digit. In another, attention improved only in specific contexts, faltering when stress or fatigue intervened. These margins, celebrated in the literature, hint at how low the bar for progress had been set. Hope was measured in increments so small they were nearly invisible. What the studies did not address was the cost of such long-term observation. The brothers had lived most of their lives as subjects in a study that never truly ended. Their names, already pseudonyms, appeared in paper after paper, stripped of personality and circumstance. They were presented as datasets, living footnotes in psychiatry's long argument with itself. In the sterile language of science, their humanity was again reduced to variables, their lives extrapolated only so they could continue to serve as evidence. Even with modern tools, the core mystery remained unsolved. Why had all four developed hysteria melancholia but not in the same way? Why was one spared enough to live independently, while another remained permanently institutionalized? Was it birth order, subtle differences in treatment, or simply the cruelty of chance? The new data clarified little. The case remained what it had always been: fascinating, tragic, inconclusive. In the end, the brothers left the laboratories of the early 20th century, much as they had decades before. Still patients, still observed, still unresolved. The improvements noted in the charts could not erase the history of abuse, nor could they dissolve the genetic fault line that had shaped their lives. They had become more stable, perhaps, but no closer to escaping the fate that psychiatry had long since written for them. The question that remained was no longer entirely medical. Were these men still patients who deserved care and dignity? Or had they become permanent exhibits in science's archive of hereditary madness? The silence of the records offers no answer. What is left are the charts, the graphs, the small advances preserved in typewritten tables, fragments of lives once called miraculous, then deemed pathological, and finally filed away. Time did what psychiatry could not. It carried the brothers forward, away from the labs and charts, into the ordinary passage of years. Yet even in old age, their lives remained entangled with the illness. The miracle of their identical birth, once studied to prove a point, had, by the early 20th century, become a diminishing archive. Each death erased another piece of a case that had shaped psychiatric history. The first loss came in 1905 when Victor died. His life had been most closely tied to institutions, to the wards and corridors of asylums that were his permanent address. Doctors described him as a chronic patient, his symptoms never yielding to medication, his days consumed by cycles of paranoia and withdrawal. When he passed, it was not with the notoriety of a subject once celebrated in journals, but quietly, his absence noted in obituaries that made no mention of fame, no history, only a date of death. For psychiatry, his death was another data point, proof that some trajectories never stabilized. For his family, it was the loss of 1/4 of a miracle that had begun in unison. A year later, in 1906, Marcus followed. His path had been uneven, marked by alternating periods of independence and collapse. He had known periods of relative stability, only to be pulled back into the orbit of care, unable to sustain his footing. His death, so soon after his brother's, added a finality to the pattern. The scientific records that once measured his responses to tests and craniometry sessions now concluded with the simplest entry: deceased. Elias's death in 1920 drew out the silence further. He had lived longer, his symptoms somewhat mitigated by decades of sedatives, but his life never strayed far from the shadow of hysteria melancholia. He existed in the middle space, not fully institutionalized nor fully independent, marked by dependence and fragility. When he died, the world barely noticed. No newspapers revisited the miracle of 1845. No obituaries explained that his face had once been studied alongside his brother's as evidence of heredity. His absence closed another chapter, leaving only one voice from what had once been four. That voice belonged to Theo. Of the brothers, he was the one who had forged something resembling a normal life. He found steady work as a blacksmith, where his skill and attention to detail were praised. He married, raised children, and managed to live with a degree of stability. Yet the illness never left him entirely. Records show he suffered from periods of withdrawal, moments when the paranoia whispered at the edges of his otherwise functional life. To his family, he was both a father and a patient, capable and fragile. He embodied the paradox of survival, more resilient than his brothers, but never entirely free. In later interviews, Theo reflected on his childhood, the father's severity, the constant presence of researchers. His testimony carried both weariness and clarity. He knew his identity had been shaped not just by the illness, but by the world's insistence on studying it. He carried the weight of 3 absent brothers, each gone before him, and the knowledge that he had been the exception, functional, enduring, able to live outside the institutions that claimed the others. To outsiders, he was the survivor. To himself, he was a reminder, living proof of a story that began with 4 and ended with 1. The strange truth of his survival lay not just in his endurance, but in the fragments he carried. Every memory, every detail of their shared childhood became his alone to preserve. He remembered the father's punishments, the photographs staged for newspapers, the labs where instruments traced their skulls. With his brothers gone, those memories could not be corroborated or disputed. They belonged only to him, and through him, the case itself remained alive. Psychiatry had long since moved on to new tools, new theories, new debates. But the Fairmont brothers lingered in textbooks as a symbol of mental illness's entanglement with genetics and trauma. By the time Theo stood alone, he was less a patient than a relic of a study that had begun in the 1860 seconds and never truly ended. His survival was not freedom, but a continuation, as if he carried within him the archive of 4 lives. In the end, the brothers' story was not symmetrical. Their identical start had fractured into different outcomes, and their deaths came at uneven intervals. The miracle of their birth, celebrated as a single event, had dissolved into silence, one voice at a time fading out. Theo's survival meant that he alone bore the burden of remembering, the last witness to a tragedy that began in unison. And so, the story of 4 identical boys, once hailed as nature's triumph, ended in solitude. One man left carrying the fragments of all, the final echo of a case that began as a marvel and ended as the quiet endurance of a single life. In the long history of psychiatry, certain cases stand as landmarks, shaping how illness is understood and recorded. The Fairmont brothers became one of those cases, born identical, diagnosed identically, yet fractured into different lives. They forced science to confront questions it had long sought to simplify. Their story revealed not certainty but ambiguity, the tangled knot of heredity and environment, of biology and brutality, of miracle and tragedy. The landmark text came in 1865, written by Dr. Elias Thornton, the Fairmont Quadruplets. A case study presented the brothers as evidence of a sorrowful complicity. Their illness, Thornton argued, could not be explained by genetics alone, nor by trauma alone. It was the interaction between the two, the biological fault line and the father's cruelty, that had produced their collective collapse. The book became a reference, cited in lecture halls and textbooks, shaping generations of psychiatric training. The impact was immediate. For decades, psychiatry had been pulled between heredity and environment. The Fairmonts offered both in a single family. Their identical DNA made the genetic argument undeniable. Their abusive childhood made the environmental case equally compelling. For researchers, the brothers became a rare opportunity to study the collision point of two theories, a living laboratory that could not be replicated. In the sterile pages of Thornton's book, they were reduced to charts, test scores, and clinical observations. Their humanity was stripped away, but their significance was preserved. Critics emerged, too. Some argued that the focus on heredity obscured the violence of their upbringing, that the father's tyrannical rule and the invasive procedures imposed on two of the sons were more than environmental factors. They were traumas, heinous and destructive. Others criticized psychiatry's fascination with reductionism, its willingness to sacrifice individual lives to fit theoretical frameworks. For them, the Fairmont case revealed not just the limits of science, but the dangers of turning patients into symbols. Yet the case endured through the end of the 19th century and beyond. Follow-up studies re-examined the brothers with new tools, neuropsychological testing, cognitive assessments. Each study added another layer to the file, confirming the unevenness of their outcomes, the impossibility of drawing neat conclusions. Identical genetics had not produced identical futures. Trauma had not struck with uniform severity. The result was both profound and unsettling, a reminder that science, even when armed with data, could not fully explain suffering. For society, the brothers' story revealed the cost of spectacle. They had been celebrated at birth as a miracle, paraded in photographs and newspaper clippings, their very existence treated as a public asset. Then their collapse was dissected in journals, their symptoms turned into case studies. At no point were they allowed the anonymity, the privacy of ordinary lives. Their identities were hidden under pseudonyms, but their experience became the property of the archive, preserved not for the family album, but for the medical textbook. Their legacy lies in what they exposed, the limits of heredity, the persistence of trauma, the impossibility of neatly separating nature from nurture. They became a cautionary tale, not just about illness, but about psychiatry's hunger for clarity. 4 lives, born in celebration, consumed by illness, and remembered not as sons or brothers, but as data. The photographs of their childhood remain. 4 boys in matching clothes, their faces nearly indistinguishable, looking into the lens of a world that expected them to embody a miracle. In retrospect, the image reads differently. The smiles look rehearsed, the symmetry unsettling, the promise of sameness already clouded by what was to come. Today, their story lives less in family memory than in medical literature. Their names, still pseudonyms, appear in footnotes and lecture slides, reminders of a case that refused to give psychiatry the easy answers it sought. The miracle of their birth was never fulfilled as a miracle. It was consumed by illness, by trauma, and by the relentless scrutiny of science. The final image is the silence of the archive. 4 identical brothers, remembered more in journals than in photographs, their lives recorded as evidence more than memory. Fated birth was the moniker chosen for them, meant to conceal but also to foreshadow. In the end, it was not a prophecy, it was the reality that was lived. The Fairmont brothers began as a miracle. 4 identical sons, born in unison, celebrated as proof of wonder in a turbulent era. But their lives became something colder. Case files in psychiatric archives, dissected by science, remembered more as evidence than as human beings. Their story forced psychiatry to acknowledge its limits, to recognize that heredity and trauma cannot be cleanly disentangled. Yet what haunts most is not what the doctors concluded, but what was lost. 4 lives reduced to charts, their humanity preserved only in fragments. Even now, their names are spoken more in textbooks than in families. The miracle of their birth was eclipsed by the reality of their collapse. The fated birth was never a prophecy, it was the truth that was lived, sealed in silence. If you want to hear more of these forgotten histories, stories that reveal the hidden costs behind science, family, and faith, subscribe to The Forgotten Echo and let me know in the comments what time it is where you are tonight, and does this story feel different when you imagine it happening in your own town?